I love Percy Jackson. Like, this is as close to Camp Half-Blood as I could get, like, professionally. With the look, John, I want to start with you because I spoke to the incredible Rick Riordan earlier this summer, and he's just such a wonderful guy. But one thing that he told me was that he was involved every step of the way on this one. He was a writer's room and casting, and he was doing all the things on this series. I'm curious from your perspective, what value does that add? Because I mean, he's literally the man, the myth, the legend. He knows all the answers that you could possibly have on this series. So what was that experience for you?
I don't think there's any version of this that could have worked without it. And I think not just his involvement, but his willingness to be open to new ideas and to reconsider things that are and have been for decades canon in this world. There was never anything I felt uncomfortable about saying, like, what if this worked a little differently? Or what if we added this? It was a two-way street. I think he and Becky both, their willingness to adapt and their availability. I think it would have been extremely difficult for me to make those kinds of determinations alone in terms of what belongs in this and what doesn't belong in it, because it's not my world. This is really their story in a meaningful way. Having them there to do it was made you feel like you knew when you were in bounds and when you were out.
That makes a lot of sense. Dan, I want to come to you because one of the other things that Rick said was really important was specifically before anything really came to fruition, just kind of early talks. Everyone on the team had this conversation of like, we need to make sure the kids on this series feel safe, feel valued, feel respected, all of these things. Talk to me about those conversations. How important was it? I mean, because they're young kids. They really are. You true to age here.
From the very beginning, when we were looking at actors of this age, what it would take, it's a very different beast to build, a very different production to build, because you are working half days with these kids. You're getting about 5.5 hours a day with them. They're in school, they have homework, they have all this. And Walker worked up between like about 150 of 160 days. It's a huge commitment for these kids. But what was really special is everybody looked after them. Everybody wanted this to be a great experience. The first thing that Rick, John and I, and Becky, we all said was, if we come out of this and these kids didn't have the time of their lives, then we failed. It was so crucial that they had a wonderful experience, and I believe they did, and they're so bonded, but it was necessary to make sure they had everything around them to succeed. And they're such pros. Like, we got so lucky with these three. They're such pros, but they also just are a delight. And it was completely contagious amongst everybody who was working with them, just having a really good time, even when the work was really challenging.
I'm obsessed with all three of them in each of their characters. And from what I hear, it was very fun. I've heard that there was dancing on set, just like dancing at the end of the day after one of those like long days, and they still really just had fun with it. Curious about that vibe, like as a whole, because there aren't just kids on this show. You do have the adult players, and you do have a whole crew, and I mean all the moving pieces to bring a TV show together. So talk to me about the dynamic and kind of like making sure that like there is that balance of fun, but also the balance of like, okay, so we're making a TV show. We got things to do here.
Walker loves camera. He loves the camera department. He loves all the details of being with the camera team. And I remember he loved to do the slate, just every time to do the slate. And I remember the DP coming up to me and saying, I feel like I'm distracting him by allowing him to do that. Because he's got to be prepping his lines and focusing on that moment rather than doing this in that moment. And I said, never stop that. Like that, because it was the best example of, it makes him so happy. He feels so a part of the process, every part of the process, and we needed to keep that going. And even when the adult actors came in, even when these like top pros, most of them were parents. Most of them loved the books and came to it because their kids loved the books. So there was so much that they could talk about and connect to the kids on. And even if they came in for a week or they came in for a couple days, it was just like immediate chemistry. And these kids got to meet some of their idols.
I love that so much. And the mental image of him just constantly slating.
Always.
It brings me a lot of joy. Well, John, I want to come back to you because I mean, you mentioned talking to Rick a lot about like what works, what maybe doesn't work in the series. There's a lot, there's so much book accuracy. It's kind of, I mean, down to the episode title. Like you got dialogue, but down to the episode titles, which I know everyone freaked out about. I have a feeling it is so. I just kind of want the reassurance here. Is this the norm? Like if we get as much Percy Jackson as we want, if we get 5 seasons for 5 books, is this kind of what it's going to look like going forward?
There hasn't really been a moment since this started in which there wasn't a commitment to a fidelity to the source material. I don't think Rick and Becky would want to do it any other way, and frankly we wouldn't want to do it any other way. It's always an exercise of it's a constant exercise of figuring out how to get this material from one medium into another. It doesn't just port over, but the intent of making sure that its soul lives in the right place, and that its heart's in the right place, I think is ever present, and I don't imagine that diminishing in any way.
Incredible. I am curious though, because like in the end, there are things that maybe just don't work for what you guys are trying to do. They just don't necessarily work in a television medium. Curious if any examples spring to mind that you kind of feel comfortable getting into. Was there anything that like you really, really tried and you guys wanted to make work and it just like it wasn't feasible for this medium?
I don't think there was anything structural that we felt like we desperately wanted it to be in the show and we couldn't get it in. I think there were some tonal things that just play differently when you're reading them in your own voice in your own head than they would play when you see them on screen. We've talked a little bit about Gabe, and I think in the book it's strongly suggested that that he is more monstrous. And I think when you're reading it, especially when you're a kid reading it and you can just read right past it, that's a different thing than seeing it and seeing it happen to somebody that you really care about. And so it was important, I think, to find a way to tell that story about him being a monster in Percy's life in a different way. And we got very lucky in Tim, who was able to find the monster in a doofus who you can laugh at, but also understand why Percy is excited to get him out of his house.
Yes, 100%. Dan, I'll come to you. I mean, we talked a little bit about the adults. I want to talk about more of the adults because, like, the gods that you have, literally, I mean, gods in the field. You got Lynn and Jason and Timothy and all of these people. And I'm just saying names like I know these people. We're very close friends, actually. But is there a wish list going forward? I have to assume there is. I mean, who would you guys like if you could dream cast any kind of, surprise appearance by a certain god that we have not seen yet? Who would it be? Who would be playing them? Tell me your secrets.
It's hard to think about who the future gods will be yet, as we build it. We look at like how this came together this season, and you just feel like we got that dream group. And all the names that you mentioned, I just have such overwhelming like feelings about each one of them and how they fit into the larger canvas and puzzle of this complicated story. What was also great about adapting it now, where Rick does have all of these books, is we could dig into those and bring little things into it, like pulling some gods that are not in the Lightning Thief into this first season. So that was exciting in its own right, to be able to dive into other gods that don't exist there. So I just love every one of those people that you mentioned and all the other ones as well.
I'm just obsessed with every single one. Literally every casting announcement that came out for the show, especially when Mantzoukas came out, I was like, guys, this is gonna be a perfect show.
He is that funny. That man is brilliant.
It's an easy thing to lose track of, that you're bringing in new grown-ups to be with these kids who have never really spent a lot of time with other actors on set. And every time one of them walks onto set, they have a tremendous amount of influence in terms of how that day is going to go, and in terms of how those kids see someone who has had a long career in this business behave. And so you're really exposed to the kinds of people, forget about the kind of performance you're getting, but the kinds of people that show up on set. And I think both through trying to be really careful about that and just sheer dumb luck, we ended up with a run of people. Every one of them was somebody I would leave my kids with for the day. And that's, not a given, but just a great group of people, without exception.
I love it, guys. That is my time. But thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I appreciate your work on this show. I've been a fan of the series for a long time, so I'm happy to see it on my screen again and in such an incredible way. You guys are great. Congrats, and thank you again.
Thank you very much.